back and seeing what else he's painting. He will be doing a painting demo on Thursday, March 16th at 6 p.m. So that'll be in these rooms, and you'll actually get to see him paint. We're going to listen to the Bodyguard soundtrack for Whitney Houston, and he's going to paint Whitney Houston. So not an author, but we were sort of moved to do that. Because we're going to be starting another new series. It's a record listening club. It's called The Listening Booth. And so I have 3 people lined up right now. They're going to play their favorite record or a record that really speaks to them, like a real record on a record player. And so we'll just come, they'll talk about the record a little bit. We'll actually listen to hopefully the entire record. So the first one of that is March 27th at 6 p.m. That's Denise Phillips. I don't know if you know Denise. She owns Gathering Volumes, the independent bookstore in Perrysburg. I'm not going to tell you what she's playing. I'm just going to give you a clue. It's a 90s movie soundtrack. And actually, Rob is going to come and paint something that goes along with the soundtrack. So you can come and listen. Probably a profanity warning. And then super, super excited for this. 2018 Boston Marathon winner Des Linden will be here in Perrysburg. This is like a co-partnership program with Gathering Volumes, the library, and Dave's Running. We sold too many tickets. We were going to have her here. We sold out, so we're moving to the Perrysburg Junior High. That will be April 6th at 7 p.m. You do need to buy a book, which is your ticket, so $29 for the book. But if you have a child, the child gets in free, so okay. So sorry that we have to sell tickets, but publishers request. But that'll be really cool. She'll do pictures afterwards, and there'll be some giveaways and refreshments from Brooks Running Shoes. That's all I have. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Jolie Sheffer. She is an associate professor of English and American Culture Studies and the director of the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society at Bowling Green State University, and the author of The Romance of Race, Incest, Miscegenation, and Multiculturalism in the United States, 1880 to 1930, and Understanding Karente Yamashita. And she will be introducing our speaker.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you all for being here. And welcome for tonight's ICS Faculty Fellowship Lecture featuring Dr. Ryan Ebright. As Natalie mentioned, I'm Jolie Sheffer, and part of the mission of ICS is to really connect the BGSU campus with the wider community. And we want to be sort of a place to foster really important and new conversations on issues that are highly relevant and timely. Our faculty fellowship program is one of the ways in which we try and connect experts on campus to share their work more broadly with the public, and to help us all to understand the institutions that structure our lives, to make us sort of more informed citizens and to feel like we know a little bit more about how to make change in the world. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Bowling Green State University and its campuses, and BGSU does have a Perrysburg campus, so Perrysburg falls into this, are situated in the Great Black Swamp in the lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations, present and past, who were forcibly removed to and from this area. So we seek to recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts towards decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who've been living and working on this land from time immemorial. This acknowledgement of land, labor, and a history of systemic racism is one way to show respect to indigenous communities, but it's meaningless without follow-up action. So we ask, as part of kind of the ICS message, that as you are navigating the world around you, that you recognize and address inequality where you find it, and to really be an agent of change in your organizations, in your communities, to try and create more access and equity all around us. And that can happen in all sorts of avenues, whether it's education, housing, health, law, and commerce, and we all have a part to play in trying to make this a more equitable world. Accordingly, I also want to recognize the often invisible labor of the folks who have helped set up this room tonight and who will clean it up after we leave, and those who work to maintain it. And I want to thank Natalie and the Wayne Public Library for allowing us to share this space tonight, and to the College of Arts and Sciences at BGSU for helping us with some of the marketing and support. And I'd especially like to thank some of the ICS staff. There are 2 graduate students who are working with me this semester who are here tonight, Stanley Owasu and Joe Elia. And then joining from afar, remotely checking in, making sure the tech is working. We are live streaming this event, are Iswat Janad, Renee Ayala, and we have an undergraduate intern, Andy Burrows. And they've all done a lot of work behind the scenes to help prepare for tonight. So thanks to them. And now, to the reason you're all here, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ryan Ebright, who, as I mentioned, is a faculty fellow with ICS this semester. Ryan has a PhD in musicology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research centers on opera, song, and intersections of music and drama, with an emphasis on 20th century and contemporary opera, minimalism, and 19th century lieder. Ryan presents regularly at conferences nationally and internationally, and his public writings have appeared now quite regularly in the New York Times, as well as places like New Music Box and other venues. So tonight's presentation will center on contemporary attempts to remake opera in an American image. Ryan explores how American opera has transformed significantly over the past 4 decades since the avant-garde opera Einstein on the Beach first made waves in 1976. Quick announcement, if you would like to be added to the ICS email list or want to find out about other events we host, you can email us at ics@bgsu.edu. I've got some stickers at the back to our podcast. I will be talking with Ryan this Friday, and that will become available in our next season's podcast. We have lots of great conversations with local BGSU alumni, faculty, staff, and students talking about the really interesting work they're doing for the public good. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ryan Ebright.
All right. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Is the microphone good to go? All right, super. So I'll just echo some of what's been said already, what Jolie said. Thank you to Natalie Dolan and the Wayne Library for hosting this event. Thank you to Jolie Sheffer and the ICS team for sponsoring the event, and also ICS for supporting my research through a research leave this semester, which has allowed me to just focus on writing and researching. So let's see here. My talk tonight is coming from a book that I'm writing titled Making American Opera After Einstein. So over the past decade or so, it seems like forever, I've been looking at how opera in the US has changed since the mid-1970s, when Philip Glass and Robert Wilson's opera Einstein on the Beach was performed at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. Some of these changes have to do not only with how opera is funded, marketed, and produced, but also how it's defined and created and experienced as an art form. So if there are any opera fans out there among you, and I know there are at least a few, you've probably noticed that it's quite common nowadays for opera companies to include at least one contemporary American opera, or mostly contemporary American opera, in each of their seasons. In recent seasons, for instance, Toledo Opera has performed Janine Tesori and Tazewell Thompson's opera Blue. That was just last season. Before that, they had performed Douglas Moore's Ballad of Baby Doe, which is from sort of mid-century. And up the road in Toledo, they presented Anthony Davis's X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, just this past May in a pretty major revival, as well as Robert Rodriguez's Frida, about the life of Frida Kahlo. This, however, was not always the case. In fact, only in the 1980s did the creation of new American operas really take off in what some critics call a new golden age of American opera. So tonight I'm going to use the history of one particular opera, Meredith Monk's Atlas, to help illustrate some of the transformations in American opera that took place in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, as well as some of the tensions that arose as various opera administrators and artists, composers, performers, critics, and others sought to redefine what American opera is and what it could be. So, those are some announcements. That's the title of the talk. which has been advertised under different names. But tonight I'm focusing on Atlas in order to illustrate broader transformations. So Atlas is an opera by Meredith Monk that premiered at Houston Grand Opera in February of 1991. By the early 1990s, Houston had become sort of the de facto center for new American opera. If you wanted to see operas by Verdi or Wagner or Mozart or Puccini or any other of the sort of standard composers, you could go to probably your regional opera company or the Metropolitan Opera in New York. But if you wanted to see something new and something American, Houston was one of the places to go. So even in this advertisement for Atlas that you see here, though, you get the sense that Atlas is something different for Houston Grand Opera, and it's probably too small to read, but I'll point out that the sort of advertising copy is trying to give a sense of what audiences can expect, and it's not particularly helpful. It says some call Meredith Monk's work avant-garde, some call it trans-categorical. They're not really sure how to label Meredith Monk, which, for reasons that will become clear in a moment. But then there's this interesting sentence here. Using film, voice, dance, drama, and music, Atlas is both highly visual and oral, a true contemporary piece. So we have a lot of different artistic mediums there: film, dance, music, drama, voice, but there is one that is conspicuously absent from that list: words, which is a pretty fundamental part of opera, at least traditionally. So the story and structure of Atlas, as I'll discuss in a moment, are actually pretty conventional, but the way that the story is told, the how of it, are actually quite unconventional. Atlas is told primarily using wordless music and movement. So Atlas was loosely inspired by the life of the early 20th century Belgian-French explorer Alexandre David-Néel, who lived a totally fascinating life and wrote quite a lot about it. Among other things, in the late 1880s, when she was in her early 20s, she converted to Buddhism. In the 1890s, she was in Tibet working as an opera singer. And then in the 1920s, she traveled to Tibet, she was in Vietnam working as an opera singer. And in the 1920s, she moved to Tibet and explored there and was part of the culture, which is significant because at that point in history, that country was closed to visitors. So Monk found sort of loose inspiration in this idea of exploration that David-Néel embodied. More generally, Atlas follows the structure of the hero's journey as outlined by mythologist Joseph Campbell. And this is something that Monk herself has talked about as being an inspiration for the sort of general contour of the opera. So this narrative, if you're not familiar with it, plays out across countless myths and stories. You could think of Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. It has a number of typical components. So call to adventure and departure from the known into the unknown. And then the hero typically encounters a series of challenges, has a revelation, subsequent transformation, and finally a return to the known. And in fact, the three parts of Atlas map quite nicely onto this hero's journey structure. So part one of Atlas is called Personal Climate. We open in the home of a young Alexandra, present day, not historical for what it's worth. A young Alexandra and her parents. Alexandra dreams of travel, and yet her parents are hesitant to let her go. So in one touching trio called Future Quest, her parents eventually sort of acquiesce to Alexandra's desire to leave home and go explore. And so I'm going to play for you this example, a short excerpt, so you can hear the way in which Monk sort of tells a story and tells us something about the characters, even in the absence of words. So one thing you can listen for is you'll hear three voices, two female voices, one male voice, and the higher voice is much more active. So it's higher, it's active. It's a way of signifying the young Alexandra's sort of youthful energy. The lower voices, the mother and the father, are much sort of slower moving rhythmically, and also have a sort of plaintive quality to them. La 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 This is the mother singing. So Alexandra sets off from home, and part one of the opera ends with her essentially choosing the companions who will accompany her in her journeys around the globe. And so I have a short video clip from the production when it went to Brooklyn Academy of Music in 1992. And in selecting her companions, Alexandra essentially sort of auditions them to see how well they can join into a sort of musical dialogue with her, which actually is a really good way of conceptualizing how Monk herself auditioned singers for the opera, which I'll get to later. But one thing you can listen for in this film clip that I'm going to play, or I should say a couple of things that you can listen for. One is that underneath the singers, there is this repeated 7-beat pattern in the strings. And Monk tends to use these sort of repeated instrumental patterns so that the voices can kind of play above them. So that's one thing to listen for. The other thing you might note, or another thing that you might note, is the sort of dialogue that is created musically between the different characters. And then a third thing that you might note is that the characters also use these sort of repeated patterns of movement that complement what they're doing vocally. So this is a couple of short clips from the scene where she's choosing companions. You'll hear some of the only actually spoken text of the opera, but pretty quickly the companions that she's sort of interviewing move into this sort of world of wordless vocalization.
I am strong. My heart is broken. I am a good cook.
So they move into kind of a unison there, signifying their compatibility.
I have desire.
And they're joined by a third companion.
I have a dry sense of humor. Good hiking boots. Hey yo, 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 hey yo. Hey yo, 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 hey yo,
So by the end, they're all singing their sort of own characteristic vocal music if they all fit together. So that's the end of part one, and in part two, subtitled Night Travel, Alexandra and her companions are led by a pair of sort of guardian angel type spirit guides that lead them to different geographic locales, such as forests, deserts, agricultural communities. And along the way, they also encounter various ghosts and spirits, which are sort of vestiges amongst early ideas for the opera when she thought it was going to be an opera about ghost stories. So in this picture, for instance, you can see that one of the travelers is accosted by a hungry ghost. And if you're wondering what's going on there, it's actually just a singer on top of another singer's shoulders. But in the theater, it's quite striking. It took me a while to figure out that it was actually that simple. This act, this part two, which is really the sort of most travel-oriented part of the opera, ends with the companions sort of narrowly escaping a technocratic dictatorial dystopia. And then finally, in part three, which is subtitled Invisible Light, Alexandra and her companions find themselves on what I can best describe as a sort of different spiritual plane of existence, sort of almost an out-of-body experience. And in contrast to the rest of the opera, this act of the opera is sung entirely a cappella, so that means without instruments. And in my opinion, it has some of the most ravishing music in the entire production. I'm just going to play you a short clip from this that gives you a sense of the sort of stillness and sereneness and beauty of this music. So one of the things that Monk likes to do musically is basically divide up a melody among different singers, and so you get this sort of pocket-like effect. And then in that example, what I find really delightful is the way in which each singer's notes gradually become longer, so you get these really beautiful harmonies as the notes are extended. So the opera ends with Alexandra, now an older woman, having returned home and enjoying the simplicity of a cup of coffee. By all accounts, the creation of the opera was fueled by copious amounts of coffee. So if you have some familiarity with opera in general, you are probably struck by how different this is from most operas that you would go to an opera house and hear, which may lead you to wonder, as I wondered when I first encountered this, both why and how a work like this was created when it was created. It seems quite far removed from the operas of Wagner or Verdi or Puccini or Mozart. And it turns out that the answer to these questions, I like to think of them as why, how, and why then, can tell us quite a bit about the field of opera in the late 20th century, American opera in the late 20th century. And before I get into the sort of specific why and how of why Atlas was produced, I'll turn to the broader why and examine some of the larger transformations in the field of American opera that sort of made it possible for an opera like Atlas to be created. So one key transformation was the growth of the field in terms of the number of professional companies operating in the US. So in 1976, superstar American soprano Beverly Sills reported in an NEA report that the revolution in so-called regional opera in the past decade has been dramatic. Boston, Houston, Dallas, Santa Fe, San Diego, Seattle, all, to mention only a few, all have their individual production style and adventure and repertory. Their musical excellence is on par with most opera houses in the world, and most importantly, they offer chances for our young singers to grow on home soil. And Sills had sort of firsthand experience with this. She's considered to be one of the first opera singers to sort of achieve superstar status without having to go to Europe to sort of establish themselves and sort of earn their credentials as an operatic superstar. So many of the professional companies that exist today were in fact founded as part of the culture boom that happened after World War II in the United States. Many of the companies that, sorry, I already said that. As you can see from this graph, there's this sort of dramatic growth in the number of new opera companies that are formed in the post-war period. So in the 1950s, we have some of the major companies like Lyric Opera of Chicago, Houston Grand Opera, Santa Fe Opera, Washington National Opera. Those are formed. In the 60s, we have companies like Minnesota and Seattle Opera. And in the 1970s, there's this veritable explosion of opera companies in the US. Many of them smaller regional companies that are sort of filling a regional niche for operatic production, but also companies like Detroit Opera, Opera Philadelphia, Opera Theater of St. Louis, which has a commitment to performing only operas in English language, and small companies like Opera Ebony in New York. Yet amid this astonishing transformation, or so conventional wisdom goes, American operas themselves were sort of largely neglected, found only in a few adventurous companies like New York City Opera, Minnesota Opera, and Houston Grand Opera. So lots of opera companies, lots of American opera companies, not so many American operas. One of the things that has surprised me in looking into this time period, though, was that in fact, American opera was thriving in the 1970s, in part buoyed by the bicentennial year in 1976, when there was a lot of interest in celebrating the bicentennial artistically. Opera was no exception to that. In surveying the landscape for contemporary opera, the Metropolitan Opera's Central Opera Service, which is sort of like an information clearinghouse for opera that tracked various productions, found that US composers had created nearly 400 new works between 1967 and 75, quite a significant number. And the half decade that followed between 75 and 80 saw even more, with 455 new American operas or music theater pieces. So new American operas, assuming you adopted a fairly broad understanding of what an opera is, was alive and well, just not in those professional opera companies. So American opera was not a defining feature of the cultural field of professional opera in America in the 1960s and 70s. In essence, there's a sort of disconnect between opera companies and opera creators. And ultimately, in order to sort of correct or change that disconnect, certain larger changes to the structure of the field and the values of the field were needed. And there's really sort of three organizations that are responsible for making this happen. The first of these was the National Endowment for the Arts, which was formed in 1965. You may be familiar with it. And in the 1970s, it played a much larger role than it plays today. In its first decade of existence, the NEA's support helped fledgling opera institutions through general grants to support their artistic seasons and professionalization. But they did relatively little, the endowment did relatively little to actually help individual opera creators, composers, performers, and so on. That role was largely filled by the National Opera Institute, which was sort of an adjunct, an opera-specific adjunct to the NEA. In fact, the first chairman of the NEA, Roger Stevens, who was chair for 5 years, basically, as soon as he stepped down as chair of the NEA, he got the NEA to fund this new project of his, the National Opera Institute, located conveniently right by the NEA. And the National Opera Institute helped the field of opera by basically doing what the NEA didn't, and that is supporting individual creators of operas through commissions for new works, helping to support productions of new works, and then also sponsoring apprenticeships and fellowships for young artists, singers, directors, conductors, designers, and so on. And the third organization that helped transform American opera was the appropriately named Opera America, which is a nonprofit service organization that was formed in 1970 to basically facilitate a lot of production sharing among the many, many companies that were now part of this national field of American opera. So sharing sets, sharing scenery, sharing costumes, even sharing English translations of foreign operas. This is part of what Opera America did. They also helped to professionalize the field by sponsoring workshops and other activities for young opera professionals who were largely coming into opera administration by after sort of earlier careers as designers or singers or what have you. So they knew relatively little about the business of opera, and so Opera America helped correct that. Workshops on accounting, marketing, fundraising, budgeting, all those exciting things. So I see the formation of these institutions and the growth of American opera as indications that American opera in the 1970s was maturing as an art world, to borrow a term from the sociologist Howard Becker, who describes an art world as the network of people whose cooperative activity, organized via their joint knowledge of conventional means of doing things, produces the kind of artwork that art world is known for. So what constitutes an art world are really the ways in which things are done, the conventional means of doing things. Art worlds are rarely static, and thanks to some of the key developments within those organizations that I just mentioned, the field of American opera, one of the things they did eventually was creating new American operas. Over the course of the 1980s and 1990s, American opera companies formed the conventions that structure how new operas are created and produced today. So I've already mentioned the role of the NOI, which funded new works. Eventually, the NEA and Opera America did as well. In May of 1978, the NEA created an independent program for opera and musical theater. Previously, that's fun. Apparently I had my key on, my ring was resting on that. So the Opera Musical Theater program, which was formed in 1978, was a new program within the NEA devoted specifically to supporting opera and musical theater. This was significant for a couple of reasons. One is that up until this point, opera had been supported at the NEA through the music program. But around the mid-1970s, 1976 if we're being exact, opera representatives at the NEA, so opera professionals who were serving on panels, began to argue that opera is not a predominantly musical art form. Instead, the phrase that they used again and again in arguing for this new program, they said opera is at least as much theater as it is music. And as a result, they said, because of opera's hybrid form, it warranted its own separate category or program within the NEA. And having that separate program would allow opera representatives much more leeway to sort of help shape the field and help support emerging trends within the field. They also felt that opera and musical theater belonged together. Previously, musical theater had been funded by the NEA's theater department. Instead, representatives argued that that opera and American musical theater were really part of a broader continuum or spectrum of music theater, and that they should be supported together, and that if they were, exciting things would happen. That was sort of the idea. And so one of the priorities when the new program launched in 1978 was to support the creation of new American works, which representatives saw as vital to the continuing health of the field. A few years later, Opera America did something very similarly. With grants from the Rockefeller Foundation and Ford Foundation and other foundations, they launched a program called Opera for the 80s and Beyond in December of 1983. So this was a 7-year, $2 million initiative that helped to support dozens of new operas, including John Adams' Nixon in China, Anthony Davis's X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, Steve Reich and Beryl Korot's The Cave, and of course Meredith Monk's Alice, and many, many others. I'm just, name checking the operas that interest me most. So like the NEA's New American Works funding category, Opera for the 80s and Beyond structured its grants to offer sort of scaffolded support for risk-averse opera institutions that had basically no experience in commissioning and producing new operas. So sort of early stage exploration grants and team building grants allowed opera administrators to go see new work, see what artists were working, not even necessarily in the field of opera, to see who they might want to work with. And then team building grants would let them explore the possibility of working with sort of said artists. Subsequent grants, like mid-stage development grants, supported workshops and other preliminary creative stages. And then finally, the largest grants, these sort of full-fledged commissioning and production grants, helped support the actual costs of putting on and mounting a new opera, which is sort of a famously and fabulously expensive art form. So that covers the sort of broader questions of how and why, the sort of changes in the field that made possible the creation of new, sometimes genre-bending operas. So I'll turn now to the more specific questions of how and why Atlas was created. And the answers to those questions are illuminating insofar as they help to reveal the conventions that opera companies relied on when producing operas in the 1980s and 1990s. To a certain degree, I see Atlas as a sort of collision between two different art worlds. On the one hand, these traditional opera companies, and on the other hand, the sort of experimental avant-garde communities with which Meredith Monk was affiliated. In fact, one of the key ideas of the Opera America's 80s and Beyond initiative was to imbue opera with new life by joining the innovation and experimentation of avant-garde composers and artists with the resources of traditional opera institutions. And Philip Glass's and Robert Wilson's Einstein on the Beach was sort of like the poster child for like, this is what could happen if you fund experimental artists working in opera. So to that end, when Opera America launched their new program in December of 1983 at their annual meeting in New York City, they included a sampler concert called New Directions in Opera, which was sort of like meant to give attendees a taste of what was going on in terms of music theater in the sort of downtown New York art world. So this concert, let's see, where am I here? This concert was curated by Harvey Lichtenstein of the Brooklyn Academy of Music and Mary MacArthur of The Kitchen, which was an arts venue that supported music and dance and video in downtown New York City, a lot of experimental work. And this particular concert included 5 different sort of excerpts from different works, including Robert Ashley's television opera, Perfect Lives, which is an opera that takes place over a number of like 30-minute television episodes. Very strange. Robert Telson and Lee Royer's The Gospel at Oedipus, which is a sort of African-American musical adaptation or retelling of the Sophocles play Oedipus at Colonus. And this eventually went to Broadway, actually, and starred Morgan Freeman. as well as other pieces on the concert included short excerpts from Anthony Davis's X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, and of course, Meredith Monk's vocal sextet, Dolan music. So I'm going to play for you now a short excerpt from Dolan music, so you get a sense of what opera administrators were hearing. Oh, I did it again. I'm sorry. I need to not try to hold two things at once with my hand. So you get a sense of what opera administrators who were attending this meeting would have heard. So Dolan music, I'll just say briefly, is a large piece for 6 singers and cellos, and it lasts about 23 to 25 minutes. And sort of like the other examples of Monk's music that you heard, it doesn't use any words. It's largely vocal, and it treats voice as a sort of expressive medium on its own. The 6 singers, you only see 3 of them, but you'll hear all of them. You almost get the sense that they are sort of communicating in a sort of made-up language. And this is something that Monk was specifically going for with Dolan music. Dolan refers to the sort of large Neolithic structures that are found throughout Europe, sort of like very old burial mounds made of giant stones. So it's meant to evoke something sort of ancient and prehistoric. So this is a little bit of what these attendees at the Stanford concert would have heard. So this is an excerpt from a 1984 documentary, hence the blurriness when you watch it on a screen this large. So Dolan music was a pretty significant milestone in Monk's development as a composer. After studying dance and music at Sarah Lawrence College, she had moved to New York City in 1964 when she became embedded in the sort of downtown experimental art scene, which fostered artists such as Richard Serra and Chuck Close, composers like Philip Glass and Laurie Anderson, and theater directors like Robert Wilson and Elizabeth LeCompte. But before she became primarily known as a composer, Meredith Monk was actually better known as a choreographer, dancer, director, and performer who worked across and between mediums encompassing dance, film, theater, and music. And some of her most critically successful early pieces employed simple movement and music that brought together large numbers of performers in unusual places and evoked startling images. So Monk was a pioneer in what's commonly referred to as site-specific performance, which means that she often rejected traditional performance venues in favor of settings that would let her sort of bring her work into dialogue with local environments. So one of her earliest pieces, Juice from 1969, which we call it a theater cantata, it unfolded over a period of 1 month. The first part of it took place inside the spiraling Guggenheim Museum of Art in New York City, which you can see here. Second part took place at Barnard College, and then the third part took place in Monk's own Tribeca loft in New York City. 2 years later, her Joan of Arc-inspired opera epic, Her Term, Vessel, took audiences. This time it started in Monk's loft, and then went to a place called the Performing Garage, and then eventually ended up in a parking lot on West Broadway, which you can see a picture of that there. So clearly she is, by the early 1980s, she's sort of well accustomed to sort of large-scale works that opera is certainly qualifies as large-scale works. And 1976 marked a sort of key turning point in Monk's development, because this is when she begins to identify specifically as a composer, and specifically as a composer of vocal music. She writes this sort of manifesto-like notes on the voice, which is sort of a series of like aphorisms about what she thinks the human voice can do, what it represents. So for instance, she describes the voice as a tool for discovering, activating, remembering, uncovering, demonstrating primordial / pre-logical consciousness. She says it's a means of becoming, portraying, embodying, incarnating another spirit. She draws connections between voice and the body, which is something that she's constantly working on in all of her works. In number 8, where she talks about the way in which voice interacts with instruments, you get a sense here of, this is actually a good description of the way she's using voice and instruments in Atlas, for instance, where the instruments create a sort of fabric above which voices can leap, jump, slide, and so on. So I want to dwell for a moment on a couple of ideas in the notes on a voice. One is that is this one here, the voice as a manifestation of the self, persona, and personas. I see this as Monk gravitating towards music partly for its theatrical reasons. So she sees vocal music and the unorthodox vocal techniques that she uses as ways of creating sort of distinct characters or personas, even in the absence of, say, a traditional theatrical setting, and even in the absence of words. And finally, she uses voice, she views voice as a sort of language that is independent of words, that has its own nonverbal meaning and syntax. So Monk first developed this language largely through self-experimentation, and she utilizes her voice in both conventional and non-conventional ways. I'm going to give you a sense of some of the vocal techniques that Monk experimented with as she's sort of coming up with this list of what the voice can do. So Monk, in her early work and even in her later work, utilizes a number of different vocal techniques, what are sometimes called extended techniques, because they sort of extend what an instrument or a voice can do. So these include ululations, yodeling, glottal attacks. I'm not going to demonstrate these. Bird calls, insect humming, whispering, microtonal wavering, where you're sort of in between the 12 pitches of a equal temperament scale, extreme highs and lows of the vocal register, and overtones, where you're producing 2 notes simultaneously. So this is just sort of 3 short clips that give you a sense of some of the different techniques that she was experimenting with around this time. So these are glottal attacks, where you're sort of slamming your vocal cords together to create this sort of hard sound. I guess I will demonstrate. I won't demonstrate this. So she's sort of sliding between the highs and lows of her voice. And if you listen very carefully, you can hear that she's making 2 notes at once. All right, so throughout the mid-70s, Monk is experimenting with these sounds, figuring out how to make them with your own voice, with her own voice, but as a composer, that only takes you so far. And eventually, Monk said that she wanted to explore more complex textures and forms. And to do that, she formed her own vocal ensemble, drawing on performers that she worked with in her large-scale work from 1976, Corey. And so by 1978, her group had coalesced into what she called Meredith Monk Vocal Ensemble, which consisted of 3 men and 3 women. And their first big piece was Dolan music, which was a huge success and became a staple in the ensemble's repertory. And more importantly for our story, when it was performed at that Sampler concert in December 1983, it caught the attention of David Gockley, who is the sort of young, ambitious impresario of Houston Grand Opera, whose mission it was to sort of commission and produce and create a new repertory of American operas. And when I talked with him a couple of years ago, Dockley told me that one of the things that attracted him to Meredith Monk's music when he heard Dolan music is that at that concert, he said it was radical, amusing, interesting, and unlike anything else on the program. And so he thought that Monk might make an ideal composer to commission for an opera. But first he wanted to make sure that she could teach her techniques to classically trained opera singers. In a sense, he wanted a sort of trial run. So he proposed that Monk fly out to Houston and teach Dolman music, the piece that we just heard a bit of, to the opera singers in Houston Grand Opera's Young Artist Studio. In a grant application to Opera America's Opera for the 80s and Beyond program, they provided the funding for this trial run. He said the purpose of this project is to see whether A, conventionally trained opera singers can assimilate Meredith Monk's musical style and techniques, B, whether Monk can work within the confines of a conventional opera company / music theater organization, and C, whether Monk has an aptitude for music theater unrelated to her abilities as a performer. To put it another way, is a collaboration between Meredith Monk and an opera company a possibility for the future? In a letter inviting the HGO Presidential Council, the people that give a lot of money, to the September 1985 performance that resulted from the workshop, Dockley reiterated the second criteria, the ability to sort of work within a conventional company. He pointed to Philip Glass's success at moving beyond his own ensemble and entrusting his music to a producing opera company. Dockley wanted to see if Monk could do likewise. He wrote, "Up to now, her stage works have been performed by her and or her hand-picked group of collaborators. If the experiment was successful," he wrote, "we might have a new composer for the opera world. If not, we can be consoled by La Boheme on October 17th. So, excuse me. The singers in Houston Grand Opera's Young Artist Studio performed Monk's Dolman music in September 1985. There's the program for it. And Dockley's experiment was considered quite a resounding success. Opera singers could learn Monk's style and techniques. Monk's music was viable without her as a performer, and the path was thus clear for a commission. But what I find kind of interesting in tracking the history of Atlas is that the second criteria that Dockley had identified, the ability to work within the confines of a conventional company, that was a transformation that Monk was either unwilling or sort of unable to undertake. So if you recall, Atlas premiered in 1991, and this concert took place in 1985, which means that 6 years elapsed between the sort of trial run and the eventual performance. And there are a few reasons why this took so long, but I'll sort of narrow in on three: the commissioning process, the audition process, and the compositional process, all of which are sort of fairly different from the standard way of doing things operatically. The commission alone took 3 to 4 years to negotiate. Now, opera commissions are usually pretty standard. They specify the title and subject of the work, how many solo singers there are going to be, how large is the orchestra, how large is the chorus, how long will it be, how many acts, the various responsibilities of each party. While the legalese of commissions might seem mundane, in the case of Atlas, there are like multiple drafts of the commission that reflect some of the key tensions between how Monk worked as an artist and composer and how opera companies typically worked. So the two key sticking points in the negotiation process were personnel and the number of rehearsals. Monk demanded and eventually got a contract that allowed for 16 weeks of group rehearsal, which is an unprecedented amount of rehearsal time for an opera company. So by comparison, most new operas in the 80s and even today might get like 8 weeks total of rehearsals. And if you are going to see a production of Mozart's Magic Flute, there's probably been 2 weeks of rehearsals leading up to that because it's a pretty standard piece. So this is a pretty wild deviation from the norms of operatic production. The reason why Monk demanded so much time had to do with how she works artistically or compositionally. So Monk creates her works via extended collaborative rehearsals with performers. And these performers are essentially sort of improvising, learning by ear, learning through their bodies. Music notation never enters into the process. There are sort of no scores to look at. So Monk herself has described this. She says, I prefer to work in the oral tradition and usually score music after the fact. That way I can play with the forms in rehearsal, very much the way a choreographer works with dancers. I make my pieces right on those bodies and right on those voices, allowing for creative give and take. Because I often weave the music with movement, I like to wait to set my forms after I see what the movement component will entail. I sometimes make compositions that are voice, movement, and instrumental music simultaneously. I can't really do that on paper. So in a sense, Monk is sort of making an opera exactly the opposite way that from which operas are normally created, which usually a libretto and a score, the libretto are basically the words, the text of an opera, and a musical score are usually sort of the starting point for operatic creation and production. If there is a libretto or score at all, it's at the end of the process for Monk. So Monk had several ideas for possible opera subjects, including Japanese or Hasidic ghost stories. But because of the way she works, which is collaboratively and in rehearsal, she really couldn't decide what the opera would be about until she began to work with singers. So she made some sort of early strides or early attempts at creating Atlas in late 1989, first composing a little bit of music in response to pictures by the designer Yoshio Guevara. And then she also developed a duet called Facing North that she eventually incorporated into the Arctic scene in Atlas. But really the opera began in earnest in January 1990 when Monk began auditioning her singers. So just to sort of keep in perspective here, this is 13 months before the opera opened. Still doesn't know what it's about. So the audition process was also quite unorthodox. For one thing, it lasted 5 months, during which time Monk heard over 400 singers. So they started with holding sort of traditional opera auditions in Houston at the Houston Grand Opera Company. And these were sort of typical opera auditions where the singer comes in, they sing an opera aria, and if the people listening, director, conductor, if they like what they hear, they might ask for another selection. And that's kind of it. It's a fairly impersonal experience. Monk didn't really like this format. She said, in Houston, people seem to have a kind of disembodied voice. I was not just listening to the voice, but watching the whole performer. So Monk moved the auditions to New York and held them in her loft. And the way that she auditioned was basically in extended group workshops, like multi-hour, large group workshops. I talked to, well, some of the performers, but one of the performers, Katie Geisinger, who eventually became part of Monk's core vocal ensemble and did perform in Atlas, thought that this was brilliant. She said this workshop format allowed Monk to see how you performed over time, how you collaborated, how you improvised, how quick you were to pick things up vocally and dramatically and movement-wise. There were about 20 people per workshop, and I ended up doing 3 2-hour workshops. So a pretty intensive process that involved movement, theatrical improvisations, learning things by ear, singing in rounds, things like that. So Monk eventually settled on a company of 18 performers, only 3 of whom she had worked with before. Even with the contract negotiated, though, many details still remained to be clarified, and memos from the Houston Grand Opera hint at some of these difficulties. And this is where I love working with archives for what it reveals. One memo from Jim Ireland, who was HGO's managing director, said, "It was clear from the beginning that there were many different opinions and misunderstandings regarding this project." This is after a February meeting between Monk and HGO personnel 1 year before the premiere of the opera. The budget was a particular concern to all involved parties. And Monk's creative process posed union issues regarding pay and role classifications. I won't get into those details. But Ireland eventually suggested, perhaps we should just give $500,000 to Monk and say, see you in Houston in February, please have a show ready. And in the end, in fact, that's pretty much what HGO did. handing over control of most of the budget to Monk's House Foundation for the Arts. It was her own sort of production company, which spent the majority of money on rehearsal costs, to the detriment of the budget for other aspects of the opera, like costumes and sets. So those 16 weeks of group rehearsal that I mentioned earlier, though, which pretty much all the money went towards, those were arguably well spent, and marked Monk's most significant departure from the conventions of operatic production. According to countertenor Randall Wong, who sang as the Lonely Spirit, as well as one of the ice demons in Atlas, different scenes from the opera developed out of different working methods. So many of the ideas in the ice demons scene, which you can see here, these are 3 of the 4 ice demons, who are tormenting one of the travelers, who you can't quite see there, but he's collapsed on the ground. Many of the ideas from this scene, he said, came out of improvisations on melodic ideas that Monk introduced in rehearsals, whereas a different scene, the Lonely Spirit scene, was more fully developed by Monk before she introduced it to Wong. So based on cassette tapes in Monk's archives that are at the New York Public Library, it appears that after sort of this rehearsal process, this collaborative rehearsal process, Monk would then sort of further develop and solidify ideas using her own voice, which, as we heard earlier, is quite a flexible instrument. So in tapes dating from August and September of 1990, which are after an initial summer workshop period, we can hear Monk singing all 3 of the ice demon parts from this scene using this multi-track cassette tape recorder that she used to basically help in the composition process. So what we're going to hear in this cassette tape recording largely matches up to what the final version eventually became, but there are sort of small variations in terms of phrasing and timbre and the vowels that Monk chooses. But I also love this because it's you get a sense of how Monk is composing in the absence of pencil and paper. As you can imagine, this would be really, really difficult to score, to basically represent in musical notation. I'm going to skip the rest of this for time. So this is just a small example of the nearly 15 hours of rehearsal tapes that are in Monk's archives in New York. Some have Monk alone, others are with the larger ensemble. But what they show is that Monk consistently maintained an attitude of experimentation throughout the creative process, even as she began shaping material more firmly in its later stages. So internal memos at the Houston Grand Opera show how nervous Monk's working process made them. And I find these delightful for the sort of palpable sense of panic that they convey. Normally memos are pretty dry, but these are pretty interesting. One artistic administrator wrote in May of 1990, so this is 9 months before the premiere. He said, "There's a great deal of confusion here regarding numbers and identities of personnel who are involved," adding that the list of performers seemed to change daily. Another memo from November, just 3 months before the premiere. "Per Emily, only 3 pieces have been worked on. Nothing is written down. She cautions us about whether or not the piece will be ready come February." Now, it's clear from other evidence that most of the piece actually had been written or had been created by this time, but it's likely very true that little was written down. But I'm showing you these examples mainly to demonstrate how foreign Munch's working method was to a traditional institution like HGO. So the 3 months leading up to the premiere in February 1991 were a flurry of activity. The opera underwent a title change from ghost stories to Atlas to better represent the narrative that had taken place over the course of the rehearsals, particularly in the final period. And the music score, normally an early step in the process of an opera's creation, was ultimately the last. Wayne Hankin, the music director for Atlas, told me that the creation of the orchestral score came down to opening night. He said, "Somebody asked me, when was the score actually finished, as what they heard?" And the answer was pretty much somewhere between the first and second act of opening night. So for all this apparent drama, we're in the home stretch. For all this apparent drama, Munch's creative process functioned exactly as it was meant to do. Her unconventional process produced an unconventional opera. Like so many composers of the late 20th century, Munch framed her opera as an attempt to redefine the parameters of the genre, her words. Both Gockley and Munch viewed Atlas as a success. For all the tensions that exist in the documentary records, 25 years after the fact, Gockley recalled Atlas as being a remarkably problem-free project. Those are his words. Time does wonderful things. And multiple cast members I spoke with, in fact, described Gockley as wonderfully supportive, believing in their work throughout the process. So I see this as sort of suggesting that Gockley's vision and support for this work seem to have overridden, or at least perhaps alleviated, the concerns of other personnel at HGO who were more engaged in the sort of day-to-day development of this work. But Gockley's willingness to give Munch artistic freedom did come at some cost beyond the obvious loss of sort of budgetary oversight. He estimated that 20% of their regular opera patrons walked out at intermission each night, which, if true, meant that Atlas played to an auditorium less than half full every night. Most performances, in fact, barely would have filled 1/3 of the hall. These consequences, though, were okay for Gockley, who, through his commissions, was principally invested in his words, bequeathing an artistic legacy to the future, which he did by cultivating what he called risk-intensive arts philanthropy. He was famously good at getting money out of the oil-rich barons of Texas. Given that Atlas and its process of creation upended conventions for both HGO and Munch, what did each party gain from the partnership? Munch arguably saw the most to benefit, allowing her to retain her working process, even though it came with small concessions in terms of narrative and venue. In many ways, it's her most conventional piece that she's ever made. Most importantly, the partnership allowed her to work on a much larger scale than she was accustomed to, with more resources. It gave her a taste for a more varied instrumental palette and also established the new vocal ensemble with whom she would work for the next couple of decades. But by adhering to her normal process, Munch arguably limited the ability of Atlas to be performed by other companies. Her method, in which the musical score was a byproduct of performance, had ramifications for the opera's reproducibility. The score that did exist, and in fact did exist for a couple of decades, was partial, lacking or approximating most of the vocal parts. And of course, it failed to sort of accurately represent or inscribe the relationships between music and movement that are fundamental to Munch's work. So it would take more than 25 years for a usable score to be created that could serve as the basis for a new production. For Houston Grand Opera, the benefits were less obvious, and the relationship entailed more drastic changes to its conventions, arguably even its identity. Given the control that Munch maintained over all aspects of production, in many ways, Houston Grand Opera functioned more as a presenting organization than a producer. In terms of the artist-institution relationship, Munch's Atlas at Houston was more like Philip Glass's Einstein on the Beach at the Met than it was like John Adams's Nixon in China at Houston. HGO had relatively little control over casting, personnel, scenic design, and other parameters. Instead, it basically provided funding and a venue. I see this as being at odds with their identity as a leading producer of new American opera, one which was fashioned through dozens of premieres throughout the 80s and 90s. Munch's creative conventions meant that other opera companies, had they wanted to program Atlas, would have functioned similarly. And here it's worth pointing out that Atlas's co-commissioners in 1991, besides Houston Grand Opera, were only arts presenters and festivals, no other actual traditional opera companies. The changes to the field of opera in the 1970s and 80s are continuing to reverberate in today's operatic landscape. In the last decade, some US companies like LA Opera and Opera Philadelphia have adopted a more bifurcated identity, acting sometimes as a traditional producer and other times as a presenter through partnerships with independent producers like Beth Morrison Projects. This has allowed for more experimental operas to reach today's audiences. At the same time, operas from the 1980s and 90s that challenge the genre are starting to see revivals. Philip Glass's Satyagraha was performed to widespread acclaim at English National Opera and the Metropolitan Opera in a new production in 2008 and again in 2011. In 2019, 27 years after it was last performed, Monk's Atlas was performed by the Los Angeles Philharmonic, not an opera company, in a new production by the director Yuval Sharon, who's now the artistic director of the Detroit Opera. And just last May, Anthony Davis's X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, was revived by Detroit Opera after 38 years. It has since gone to Seattle Opera and Opera Omaha and will appear at the Metropolitan Opera in New York this November. Perhaps the strongest indication that the transformations set in motion in the 1970s and 80s was the announcement just last week from the Metropolitan Opera. For better or worse, it's the standard bearer or a standard bearer of opera in the US and a bastion of aesthetic conservatism. But they announced last week that its 2023-24 season will devote a full third of its season to operas by living American composers. So 6 of its 18 operas next season. That is a pretty remarkable number for that institution. Such a change, I would say, bodes pretty well for the future of opera in America. Thank you.
Other questions?
Oh, I guess